Imagine walking down a street and suddenly noticing a familiar shape where none exists, or seeing a color that feels wrong even though the light isn't changed. In the next few minutes, we'll uncover why our visual system, built for speed and efficiency, sometimes misreads everyday shapes and colors, revealing the hidden neural tricks that let us see what isn't there. Our eyes first register light and color, then the brain interprets patterns quickly. When shapes are arranged in familiar ways, the brain fills gaps automatically, speeding recognition in real time. This filling is called shape constancy, and it speeds up recognition, ensuring efficient perception. But sometimes the brain's shortcuts mislead us into seeing false edges, creating perceptual surprises. The Mueller-Lyer illusion shows how arrowheads can change perceived length, despite identical line segments. Here, identical lines appear different because surrounding angles bias our judgment, illustrating contextual influence. Color constancy also tricks the brain. A gray square looks darker on a bright background, yet it remains the same hue. The checker shadow illusion demonstrates how context alters brightness perception, revealing hidden depth cues. In both cases, the visual system relies on contextual cues to infer depth and size, guiding accurate interpretation. These cues are evolutionary tools that helped early humans quickly assess environments, ensuring survival in complex scenes. However, when applied to art or design, they can create surprising misperceptions, challenging our expectations. Understanding these mechanisms lets us predict and even harness visual tricks, opening avenues for creative communication. Pause 0.8. When you look at a group of dots, your brain instantly pulls them together into a shape. This grouping happens because of proximity. Elements close to each other are perceived as belonging together. Similarly, similarity makes us see items that share color or size as part of the same whole. Closure tricks our mind into filling in missing parts so we recognize a broken circle as complete. Continuity guides us to follow lines smoothly, turning a zigzag path into an imagined straight line. These Gestalt rules are hardwired, allowing quick interpretation of complex scenes with minimal effort. However, the same mechanisms can mislead us when patterns are ambiguous or intentionally deceptive. For example, a broken line that looks like a circle may actually be two separate shapes. Our visual system prefers simplicity, so it often invents a hole where none exists. Understanding these principles helps us recognize when perception diverges from physical reality. Pause 0.8. When sunlight shifts from noon to dusk, the wavelengths hitting your retina change dramatically, yet you still recognize a ripe tomato as red, thanks to color constancy mechanisms in the brain. Color constancy relies on early retinal processing that compares signals across neighboring cones to estimate illumination. The visual cortex then normalizes these signals, effectively subtracting the estimated light color from the object's signal. This neural computation preserves perceived hue even when the actual spectral power distribution varies widely. Contextual cues like surrounding objects or shadows provide additional reference points for the brain to refine this estimate. When a blue-lit room contains a white sheet, the brain interprets the sheet as white by discounting the blue bias. Conversely, if that same sheet is placed under a warm amber light, it appears slightly yellowish despite its true color. The 3D rendering in the visual shows how cone responses shift with illumination, while cortical neurons maintain stable hue representations. Thus, everyday shapes and colors trick your visual system by exploiting these adaptive computations that prioritize contextual consistency over all wavelengths. Pause 0.8. When you look at a picture, your brain first registers basic shapes and colors. These low-level signals travel to higher visual areas where attention selects what to focus on. Attention acts like a spotlight, filtering out irrelevant details and highlighting the most salient features. Your expectations, built from past experiences, then shape how that spotlight is directed. If you expect a familiar object, your brain will look for its typical outline even if it's blurred. This top-down influence can cause the visual system to fill in missing parts of an image. The result is that you perceive a complete shape where none actually exists. Color cues also guide attention, making certain regions stand out and reinforcing expectations. When the expectation matches the actual input, perception becomes smooth and accurate. But when it mismatches, the brain may still impose a familiar pattern, creating an illusion. Thus, everyday shapes and colors trick the visual system into seeing what isn't there. Pause 0.8. The journey starts in the retina where light hits photoreceptors. Rod cells gather dim photons while cones encode color through three types. Signals travel via bipolar cells to ganglion cells that form the optic nerve. At the optic chiasm, fibers cross so each hemisphere receives contralateral input. The lateral geniculate nucleus first sorts signals into layers dedicated to color and motion. Layer 4 of V1 receives the bulk of retinal output and begins feature extraction. Orientation columns in V1 detect edges, responding strongly when a line aligns with their preferred angle. Color opponent cells in V1 compare signals from different cone types to create red, green, and blue-yellow axes. These basic detectors feed into higher areas where neurons combine orientation and color cues. Complex shape representations emerge as the brain assembles local features across space. Because of this hierarchical assembly, our visual system can infer shapes that are not physically present. The same mechanism also explains why colors can appear brighter or dimmer depending on context. Thus, everyday tricks arise from the brain-efficient but sometimes overzealous feature integration. Pause 0.8. When you glance at a street sign, your brain instantly interprets the shape and color as meaning. This interpretation relies on bottom-up signals from pixels that travel through the retina to the visual cortex, but the brain also applies top-down expectations, such as knowing a red octagon usually warns of a stop sign. When context conflicts with raw data, the brain resolves ambiguity by favoring familiar patterns. This explains why a painted rectangle on a wall can appear as a window when you look from the right angle. Color constancy also tricks us. A blue-tinted object may still be perceived as green under bright sunlight. In product packaging, designers exploit shape constancy by using familiar silhouettes that suggest function without explicit labeling. Safety signage often uses high-contrast colors and simple shapes to override visual noise in busy environments. When designing interfaces, keep the hierarchy clear. Let the most important element dominate the perceptual field. By understanding these mechanisms, you can create visuals that communicate accurately and avoid misleading the viewer. Pause 0.8. We began by exploring how everyday visual cues can create mismatches between what we see and what is present. Gestalt principles were shown to drive misinterpretation of shapes, while neural mechanisms for color constancy explain why colors appear stable yet can be tricked by context. Topa-Euro's down attention was highlighted as a powerful modulator that fills in missing information based on prior knowledge. Finally, we mapped the visual pathway from retina to cortex, illustrating how lower Euro's level feature detectors integrate into higher Euro's order representations of shape and color. Together these mechanisms explain why our brains sometimes see what isn't there.